So this is a day when less words is more, and more images that provide windows to breath and movement and energy and fire is best. And so we have Joyce Young to thank every year, who sends me to Lockyer's to try and bring more fire in here. And what I tell Joyce is, every time I go to Lockyer's, and you remember that when you go to Lockyer's to look for hanging baskets, you're always looking up, right? So it always confounds me when I choose what are the most phenomenal plants, like this, and then we have to look down on them, and somehow they just aren't quite on as fire. So next year, our commitment is to hang them. And then you will get to see what I see when I go. They're the best. Anyway, so, and I think it's quite serendipitous that Aidan had to hold on to half of his pieces, because then we had to fill the space, which I think a couple of really interesting images. So this piece over here is called Fiery Woman, and it is because of this piece that I met Janine Kinch. And I went to a little drum circle in a yoga studio, and that piece was on the wall, and I went, "Who did that?" And this very gentle, quiet, humble woman said, "I did." And we've since experienced the power of her ability to communicate archetypes, all right? And then we needed something for the other side, so I thought it would be most appropriate to welcome back The Chinese Goddess of Compassion by Anne Ireland. It sat there, I think about a year and a half ago, the last time we experienced Anne's work, which was also during the season. Oh no, that was 2.5 years during Pentecost. And I couldn't help but develop a relationship with her, and I kept sneaking her home to try her on my wall. And in the end, I forked over the money anyway. So we've got fire, and we've got women who are comfortable with their divinity, because what we need to remember is that the word for spirit in Hebrew, ruach, is a feminine word, and that somehow our ancestors in this tradition, whenever they wanted to talk about the playfulness and the surprising qualities of the spirit, didn't they use feminine nouns? Yeah. When they wanted to talk about the more powerful, angry, just qualities of the divine, then they used male nouns. But I think you understand that we need to get beyond all of that. So, going to begin by reading from, I would like to think of it as Jesus' mission statement, all right? So, after his formation, which we know to be 40 days in the wilderness, but somebody in the book study the other day suggested that that formation was quite likely much longer than 40 days, could have been 2 or 3 years, in which he might have, in fact, traveled through parts of India, even, because so much of his teaching is reminiscent to some of the wisdom teaching that comes out of the more Eastern traditions, that he showed up back in his hometown, and you can only imagine, right, that the guy goes off to come back with a total reinterpretation and intention to revive his own tradition. And where has that ever gotten a prophet, right? So he stands up within the synagogue that day, and he pulls out the scroll. This is how Luke tells the story. And he reads from the book of Isaiah. And these are the words that he reads. Ruach, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recover the sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so it makes sense, you see, that when Luke is then picking up his story, this would be after the story of crucifixion and after he understands the resurrection, that he's then launching the book of Acts, which is like the okay, then what book, that he would pick up the language of spirit. And remember that whenever we read things within the biblical text that just sound wild, all right, think about not so much the wildness, but the person who wrote that story. What is it that they were trying to communicate in the images and the language? What kind of cosmology were they inviting us to find ourselves in? When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all huddled together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and the tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem, and at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all of these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language?" All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" Yet still others looked at them and said, "They are just drunk." Each season of the Christian liturgical year comes with an invitation to remember who we are. Pentecost reminds us that we are a people of fire. Filled with holy breath. Breath and spirit are the same words in the Hebrew. It is a season that reminds us then that we are akin to the man Jesus, who in his formation as a faithful Jew was reminded of his call to be a healer and a liberator from the scroll that contained the words of the prophet Isaiah. This was not a new revelation. Pentecost reminds us that we are kin to the disciples, and apparently over 120 of them were gathered together in Jerusalem, gathered fearful that they too might suffer the wrath of the empire as their teacher had. Yet these 120 men and women on fire ignited a movement within the empire that could not be contained. Now, it didn't take long for the institutional church to canonize Luke's spirited account of the gospel and sequester the Spirit's holy disruptions into creeds and catechisms. And so it's really important that we continue to wrestle ourselves from the constraints created by the institution and consider once again, what does it mean to be a people on fire? So let me suggest that we need to think of ourselves not so much as followers of Jesus, but as those who carry the fire. Kind of members of one long, huge relay team to whom fire is handed and breath, so that the Spirit of Jesus is in our bones. The spirit of Isaiah is in our bones. The spirit of Ruth is in our bones, and Esther and Mary of Magdala. I do not think that we have quite understood our power. In John's account of the passing on of Spirit, Jesus appears among his very fear-ridden friends and says, receive holy breath. Take it. Breathe it. Let it propel you. And so in thinking about this kind of power, I suggested to somebody the other day that one of the creeds of the institutional church acknowledges that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. And I'm not sure they got the whole story. I think the whole story, born out of this event and others, would suggest that we too are fully human and fully divine. That is what all the symbolism around breath and spirit and fire is intended to communicate. Not that we are just a little bit divine. What's that? It's kind of part of your, but don't be too big for your britches thinking. And I understand the lack of commitment to our divinity. But the first creation story that sought to communicate this suggests that we were made in the image of God. And then the tradition keeps providing narratives that invite us to live out of this identity, to live with courage and compassion, to be like Daniel back there in the window, stand up for what we know is our truth regardless of the consequences, to be like the woman at the well who went off and told her friends in a culture where women weren't really supposed to be messengers. Like Moses, who saw a burning bush and went, oh my goodness, I guess it's up to me. I'm not sure we think of ourselves as having that kind of power. The power that comes when we agree to be divine, to be fired up together. But the mystery that we have called God, and the teacher whom we know as Jesus, was not inviting us to be little people full of fear, cringing in obedience. That doesn't describe any of the heroes and heroines of our faith. The mystery that we have called God desires us to be full partners, invites us to step up as Jesus stepped up, as those who ate and drank with him stepped up, to be healers and liberators and fire starters together. We do this when we take responsibility for nurturing our divine nature. We do this when we override our fears with a deep knowing, and knowing that in us is that same spirit of courage and compassion. In our breath is the breath that confounded the empire. Didn't matter how many Christians they killed. The movement kept growing. That in our bones are the bones that rattled people out of their prisons of apathy and helplessness. Can we say yes to that invitation? To be fired up and live out of that unique identity. So one little story. So many of you know that we have sought to play in this community and will continue to seek to play a role in providing a place for discussions around mental health, and in particular the stigma around mental health. So we had 2 public events that were very well attended, and then we had a follow-up event because there were a number of people who indicated that they wanted to keep talking, but some of them really wanted to be part of a community of peer support. And so the date was set for the meeting, and we had a really nice man from the wider community who was a psychologist who came in and said, I will spend this first event with you and help you understand the parameters of having this kind of event, and then I'll leave you. And I wasn't quite sure at that point whether or not I needed to be part of that circle. And then it became clear that I needed to walk with those who had expressed a desire to be part of that circle. And then I had to think to myself, what is the difference between the cosmology I bring to this circle vis-a-vis the cosmology that the psychotherapist brings to this circle? And this is what I concluded. I concluded that based on this story and the cosmology communicated through this spiritual tradition, that those who gathered to be part of a circle of support were each healers. They were each healers. And so that's all I needed to communicate to each one of them, who some have wrestled with darkness for much of their life. To be able to say, despite your darkness, despite your anxiety, despite what the culture or how the culture has marginalized you, according to this tradition, you are healers. So I invite you now during this time for contemplation to connect deeply with your true identity. You are born, you are heirs of a tradition that have made you healers and liberators and fire starters. And I would challenge you to silence the voices within you or outside of you that would suggest otherwise. And I would invite you, as Nelson Mandela, in using these words at his inauguration, speaking to the trodden down people of South Africa, stop playing small. In you is the fire of the Creator. In you is the fire of Jesus and all those, both before and after him, who had the courage to honor their divine identity. Abandon the lies of your smallness. I know every one of you here, and you are all so much bigger and brighter and more beautiful than you know.